So it is with great pleasure and pride that I present to you Dr. Ivan Van Sertima.
Let me begin this evening by saying that this is part of a series. It is very important to realize that Africa is an exploded star, a shattered diamond, and that its pieces have to be followed in all the continents. You cannot have a sense of what was essentially African just by going into Africa. You have to look into Europe, into Asia, into America. I have been associated for a long time with the American thesis, the establishment of an African presence in early America. But that is just a part, is just one part of the whole story. What we are trying to achieve is a synthesis of the African presence all over the world. The African presence in Europe, which I'm dealing with tonight, is tremendously important, just as important as the African presence in early America. That when the first European entered Africa and touched Egypt, when the Greek touched the Egyptians, they did not treat them with contempt. I want you to note that it's not automatic about white and black being enemies. The whites were stunned by the achievements of the blacks. And they were not only stunned, they stood in awe. So that even though they had defeated the armies which had been taxed by battles with the Asiatics and battles with all sorts of people, the Persians and so forth, when they came in and they overpowered them, they bowed down before their God. They took the black man Imhotep and worshipped him as a god. Many black women became goddesses for the whites. Isis, who was the goddess, who was the female representation of God, she was worshipped throughout Europe, a black woman. They didn't think any woman of their race had that nobility. Artemis became the goddess of chastity. Minerva became the goddess of wisdom. These are black women. Circe in the Odyssey, a black woman. Andromeda, who helped Jason win the Golden Fleece, who married Perseus, the great Greek hero. That's a black woman. It's whitewashed afterwards on the vases, but you could see in the black women in the antiquity book, you could see what it looked like originally. And Isis became the prototype of all the great Madonnas of Europe. And even when they were broken, some of them were remade with European faces, but with the black ritual color. So it went right through. Everything was affected. They couldn't understand how the Egyptians had written such advanced medical texts. You know, the Egyptians had already done a major work on the pulse. You know, the Greeks, the Europeans, only came to terms with that advance in the pulse 1,000 years later. Egyptians had books, diagnostic percussion, studies of circulation, studies of the pulse. They had chapters that were taken by the Europeans, the Greeks, and copied word for word. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, the Greek, copied studies and fractures of the clavicle and dislocation of the mandible, copied word for word. The medical school of Kos in Europe, in Greece, was an imitation of the medical schools in Egypt. Every scholar, St. Clement of Alexandria, said that if you were to write a book of 1,000 pages, it would not be enough to put the names of Greek scholars who went to study in Africa. That was the big thing, as today in shattered Africa, Africans have to go to Europe to study. In those days, Europeans flocked to Africa to study because there was nothing much to study in Europe. Their astronomy was transformed by the Africans. They did not know how to shape the year. They had primitive, inadequate calendars. Egypt gave us the world's first accurate calendar, the 365 and a quarter day year. But of course they observed the quarter differently. They observed it at the end of 1,460 years. They had a leap year. We no longer have a leap year. We call it a leap year, but we don't have it. They did. We only have a leap day. And they split the year. After they dealt with the quarter that way, they were left with 365 days. They had 5 festival days. They created Christmas, not Europe. It's Africa created Christmas. Egypt. The word Christ is an African word, K-R-S-T, Christo, Christ. Then it was translated into Greek, Christos. It's not European. Europeans did not embrace Christ. That was to come much later. When Jesus was being crucified, it's white soldiers, Romans, who were putting the spear in him, who was putting him up on the cross because the Jews thought he should die because he had outraged the Jewish high priest by doing things and saying things that they found ridiculous. Moses had told them an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth. Jesus said, not only should you forgive your brother 7 times, but 70 times 7. Jesus had the audacity to pick up a whip and chase people out of the temple, which they considered to be a violent act. There were many things that led to that man being killed because he carried ideas, many of which you can find among the Essenes in Egypt. There are several books written by Jews that make Christ out to be an Essene. He was profoundly affected by the Egyptians because he spent his boyhood in Egypt. He was smuggled into a village called Marathia near Heliopolis. He spent his boyhood in Egypt. When you first see him in the Bible, when you first see him in the books by his disciples, they're first aware of him at the age of 12 when he's talking to the doctors. Egyptian doctors, what doctors do you think they are? And then he disappears. People put him all over the place, but we don't know for sure what he did before he went. But it is said in the Bible, in Hosea, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He goes back now out of Egypt back into Palestine to conduct his ministry. Now many of us have become disillusioned with Christianity because we mix up the baby with the bath water. We think that because Christians have behaved in the most abominable manner as they have, that has anything to do with Jesus the Christ, or it has to do with the essential Christianity. Because some Muslims behave abominably, that has to do with Muhammad. It has nothing to do with that. Once you embrace a religion, whether it be a political ideology or some sort of religious ideology, it's up to you. If you're narrow, you're going to kill people in the name of it. It has nothing to do with the essential golden strand in the religion or in the ideology. There's a far cry between Stalin and Gorbachev. It's the same communism they're talking about. There's a far cry between Muhammad and some of these people who call themselves Muslims. There's a far cry between Jesus the Christ and some of these people who call themselves Christians, who in the name of Jesus practically enslaved half the world. What's Christian about Europe? Everything they did to Africans and people of African descent was un-Christian. It is true that the image of Christ, that marvelous individual who could make his light shine, the individual beauty and power that could make his light shine against the overpowering darkness of the world. That was something that was to bring tremendous inspiration later on to many Europeans. But note, even at the time of the conversion, who do you think was the Pope? When Constantine, the Roman emperor, was converted, the Pope was a black man. You will see his picture in the slides. Miltiades, the black Pope of Rome. Or rather the black Christian Pope, because Rome later became the seat of the papacy. But the black Pope was a black man, Miltiades, 312 to 314 AD. All these things were carried into Europe. The basic idea, because the Africans very early, even going back to 30 before Egypt, they saw Horus as a Christ figure. Their concept of the Christ was already there long before Jesus was born. You could see it on their temples. We saw that, and it's almost broken and shattered, but it was drawn for us by one of the Egyptian guys, showing the resurrection, showing the angel coming to announce the birth of the child, showing the virgin birth. All those ideas already on Egyptian temples at Luxor, long before Jesus, the Christ, appeared on the earth. Those ideas, those concepts were there. They were to profoundly affect the world. They're not European things. And when you look at the science, that in particular, it is amazing, not only the medicine, but look at the calendar, look at the mathematics. Geometry was developed by the Africans along the Nile. They had to deal with complex problems because of the fluctuations of the Nile. They developed geometry. The Greeks and Romans had arithmetic, but they didn't have geometry, that more complex kind of mathematics. That came out of the Nile Valley. And a range of other things. And the Greeks admitted it. They admitted it. Now Martin Bernal brings out his book, Black Athena. And because he's white, and I'm not saying because Martin Bernal is a very good friend of mine, but I'm just trying to show you the state of mind that exists in this country, that we were saying that, the up was saying that, and nobody was paying attention. But now a white scholar says it. It's a big thing. It's like a sudden discovery. It has validity. Black Athena shows you clearly how 200, 300 years ago, it was accepted what the Greeks had said. These are black people of woolly hair, and they gave us this and that and so forth. That was known as the ancient model. No, they changed it to the Aryan model. The Germans in particular, trying to show that Egypt is a Semitic language or so Indo-Aryan elements and all sorts of things like that, and how the Greeks exaggerated their debt to the Egyptians, because even in spite of all their attempts to say that there was nothing black about the Egyptians, they were at least aware there was some black in them. It made them uncomfortable. And therefore there was a long effort, especially after slavery. How can we, as Christians, enslave people who once taught us so much and telling us about how these inferior people and how we're giving them this and giving them that, when if you really studied history objectively, you would find they gave us a great deal. That couldn't be tolerated. You couldn't sleep at night with a Christian conscience thinking that you were enslaving people who were equal in any real sense. They had to be unequal. They had to be inferior. Therefore, they had to be excluded from everything that was of significance. Even when it was found in the heart of Africa, among African people, something could not be accepted. When they found the ruins of Monomotapa, everybody said it was an African kingdom. Everybody said this was an African center in southern Africa. It's 800 years old. But when they saw the building and the marvelous conical tower, and these guys putting together stone in a manner in which it was never put together in Europe, well, it couldn't be by Africans, naturally not. It's the Portuguese built it, it's the Chinese built it, it's the Phoenicians built it, it's the Arabs built it, not Africans. Wherever they found something, if they found the sophisticated plant, the cultivated plant, somebody brought it. When I was studying African presence in early America, I was corresponding with the South African. He didn't know I was black, because my name Van Sertima, it sounds like a Boer name, it's a Dutch name. Okay, I was my ancestors were the slaves of the Dutch, because my country was once owned by the Dutch. So he thought I'm Boer like himself. I didn't say he's a Boer. He thought I'm not much different. And so he's writing these things, and I'm collecting this information because he'd found maize had entered Africa, and he couldn't understand how it had entered. And like Leo Wiener, he'd also claimed that blacks must have been in America before Columbus. But it took me a long time to realize what these guys were really saying. Blacks were in America before Columbus, but they were still slaves. They hadn't jumped at all. Because what he was really saying, when eventually he wrote me a letter in which he said, Van Sertima, if you find the yam, the Caucasian, and the Negro, all three of them West African items in America before Columbus, someone, a human being, must have brought them there. In other words, the blacks were in America because a human being, a white person who could migrate and move, brought these static people into America. Could you understand that? Do you know how deep that is? That is the reason why we have such a hell of a time recovering history. I have students, I teach students in black civilizations. After a whole semester in which I've shown them of all these various methods we've used to reconstruct history, on the plane coming from New Orleans this morning, I'm reading an essay by one of my students in which she is telling me that it's a pity we can never recover this history because we only have the oral tradition, it's unreliable. And she's quoting all of these early white scholars. And the books that she had bought at some expense from me, she wouldn't open the book. Could you understand that? She would not open the book. Now that's not true of many of my students, thank God. But could you imagine that? She has already made up her mind. I'm going to say we did great things, yes, because Van Sertima likes to say that. But I'm going to read the books that were read before because I don't have validity. I'm black. So it doesn't matter what you say, she would not, and she doesn't even know it. She doesn't know that is what the process that is happening. Can you understand the sickness? That is why we can't be casual about this. This is dead serious stuff. It's as serious as religion. And it is religion because it is making sacred again the human being. It is religious in that regard. Because that blackout, it's a blackout, a whitewash. It is as if Europe has totally overpowered us so that, as I say, we become the invisible man in history. And the whole things that come out to suggest that we are making it all up. Look at all these things. It's detailed. It's so detailed that the great thinkers, the greatest scientists in Europe before Einstein, Isaac Newton, who brought about this tremendous synthesis of all the sciences at that point in time. Do you know what he was doing? Now, he is a genius. I'm not denying that. But even he was cheating. They found a book written on various elements of gravity, written by a Moor. And he had written it, of course, is an obscure little book because there was no great printing presses at the time. He's written his, Isaac Newton, his book. And he has a lot of writing on it and discussions to himself and so forth. When he died, they found it among his papers. Nobody said anything. Recently, a man in England has brought it to light. Now, Newton was a remarkable man, though, and Newton, to the astonishment of everyone, including myself, studied Egyptology. Newton said, we thought he got his Egyptian education from Kepler, Copernicus, and Galileo. Galileo had used an African water clock in his experiment, and he had been affected by Egypt. But we found that he was actually reading Egyptian texts, and he said there are three things in which some of my work has been prefigured. One, the Egyptians knew about the atom. Of course, it didn't reach the point about atomic fission and fusion. That is a recent development. But he said that they called the atom the monad, and they saw it as the building block of the physical universe, even though they had mystical notions about it. Nobody on earth even dreamt about the atom at that point in time. Not until many centuries later. He said further, he was convinced that they had a sense of gravitational attraction because they talked about the harmony of the spheres, how these things were held in a certain relationship because of these belts of gravitation. Pythagoras came from Egypt with that theory. He'd been there, according to Newton, 22 years. I thought it was 7. This is his own brother, scientist. 22 years he spent in Egypt. And then he said that the Egyptians had a heliocentric theory of the solar system. That is, they knew that the sun was the center and the bodies revolved around the sun. That is why they were able to make such accurate calendars. Do you know in Europe they did not know that? It took a long time before Europe even knew that the earth was not flat. And they had people, intelligent scholars in Europe, telling you that if the earth was wrong, you would fall off. And they would tell you that if the earth was wrong, then there would be people in Australia walking upside down. That was a big concept for them. These are, you see, now we are living under European power, where the European media overwhelms us and all the books are European, so that we automatically assume, having been born in that prison, that mental prison, we automatically assume these people were on top of the world with all their tremendous intelligence and invention. That is not the case. And it doesn't just end with Egypt. There were other movements by Africans into Europe. Africans were not a static people. Not only had they been there migrating in the very first period, 3 African types migrated until finally the modern type, the movement, even when the Egyptians are defeated, their ideas and sciences enter Europe. And then come other movements. We found Taharqa, the Sudanese pharaoh. When I was reading about the Mohammedan dynasties, I found to my astonishment that in the Spanish history it was mentioned how a black pharaoh, Taharqa they called him, who was both a head of the army and later became a king of Egypt and Nubia, how he came in with a garrison into Spain. And they found cartouches, the signature of some of these kings, from the Shishongs to the Osorkans, that are found in Spain, and some Egyptian influences in some Spanish villages. And then came Hannibal. That's another invasion. Hannibal, and for a long time, although there are many books on Hannibal, they just said, well, he couldn't possibly be African. But I want to draw your attention to a very important essay in that book, Great Black Leaders. There's an essay on Hannibal that is very important, and there you will see for the first time the actual photograph of Hannibal as found in a coin. Now, there are many of these coins, okay, and all of them have Africoid faces on them, but this one is a special one. This is clearly Hannibal, because on the other side of the coin is the elephant Surus. This is the elephant, the only elephant that Hannibal rode. And there's an inscription telling you it is Surus. And all the battles that were involved, bringing the Africans and other people, mercenary armies across the Alps, and the final battle against the Romans is all described in that essay. For 10 years, Hannibal held power over a great part of Europe. But when his brother Hasdrubal tried to bring up reinforcements from Africa, he was murdered, and the Carthaginians lost hope, and Hannibal was abandoned, and he committed suicide. But very significant was the eventual movement in Europe by the Moors, and I want to say a lot about the Moors. The Moors, that there again greatly misunderstood. Who are the Moors? The Moors are a mix of people. In the Sahara, there were people known as the Garamantes. These are indigenous black people. However, there came in some fair-skinned Libyans. They're both black Libyans and fair-skinned Libyans. These people came in and they were known as the tawny Moors, okay, the white Moors or the tawny Moors, but the vast majority were black Moors, the Garamantes. Then at first the Arabian Peninsula was peopled strictly by blacks. Then came another group coming in, and by the time of Muhammad, the blacks were a minority in Arabia. So you have an Arabian type that comes into play. You have two types in Arabia, both a dark-skinned type and a fair-skinned type in the time of Muhammad. And in fact, it is the fair-skinned type that runs against Muhammad and pushes him into Ethiopia. Muhammad runs into Ethiopia just as Jesus went to Egypt. Both prophets go into the fastnesses of Africa when they were in trouble. And you find Muhammad retreated into Ethiopia, he and his disciples, and eventually charged back again and conquered his enemies. After his death, the ideas that inspired him were to spread over the world. It was to spread over the world because many of the Mohammedans or Muslims came into various parts of the world and tried to convert people. They went into India, they attacked India. They went even as far up as into China. They went into Africa. They intermarried with Africans. And eventually, the major part of the story occurs around 711 AD when an African general, Tariq, is sent out across the Straits of Gibraltar with 7,000 troops. 6,700 of them are black Africans, 300 are other types, probably fair-skinned Arabian types. I use the word Arabian versus the word Arab because anyone can be an Arab, anyone speaking Arabic. They move up into Spain, they conquer Spain. Now, if you go to Spain, you're going to find the same problem that you find with the Egyptians. They don't want to hear anything about the Moors. They don't want to hear anything about the Moors because the Moors, as far as they were concerned, they don't seem to understand. They don't want to go and check out what actually these guys brought into them. They don't want to hear anything about it. Yet all of our pictures of these Moors are drawn by the Spanish because the Muslims forbade the creation of images. So when there's the surrender of the Moors, it's drawn by the Spanish. Black generals surrendering. Now, if they weren't in charge and they were not the Moors, how are they surrendering? It's like if the Russians come here and we're supposed to surrender. Who do you think is going to do the surrendering? Could we surrender this country to them? I mean, it's so absurd. I mean, when you see these black faces, it's amazing. It's like this book I read when I was studying the Moors. I read this book by this English woman. A big book. For 300 pages, the Moors are fair-skinned with straight noses and blue eyes. Then things go bad and the Moors are being pushed back. And one stage there's a big battle, and then you suddenly the sentence, tremendous slaughter of the Africans. Where the hell did they come from? Amazing how many things were pushed onto the rock. You cannot imagine. And a book, that's the next book I must write. Because you cannot imagine what an impact the Moors had on Europe. Greece and Rome, their glory had long faded. Europe had fallen into a great sleep. Europe was so backward that a disease had struck and killed half the people. It was worse than AIDS. They had no protection. Public baths were unknown in Europe. Disease spread like flies. It was unbelievable, the low level of Europe. There was not a lighted street in Europe. There was not a paved street in Europe. The kings in Europe lived in barns. Then came the Muslims. They set up these fantastic mosques. Unbelievable things. If you see them, some of them today, they're absolutely unbelievable. They introduced public baths unknown in Europe. public baths. They introduced public libraries. There were private libraries in Europe for the elite who read and wrote, the few who read and wrote. There were no public libraries for the people. Europe had 2 universities. The Muslims introduced 17 universities into Europe. Everything that could be found in the outer world, everything that could be brought in where the Moors had their courts in Morocco and in Europe was brought into the universities. Everything was translated into Arabic, which, by the way, was invented by Abul Aswan, an African. It's in the diaries of Ibn Khalikan, because that script was created at the time when Arabia was largely black. It was not largely black at the time of Muhammad. And there were major figures in the Muslim. The right-hand man of Muhammad was a black man, Bilal. Many of the major figures at this time are black figures. That thrust into Europe brought 4 dynasties, and the last 2 dynasties were actually created on the Senegal River. The Al-Maravid and the Al-Mahadi dynasty, those were overwhelmingly African dynasties. The first dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty, had major African elements. The Abbasid dynasty didn't last at all. It lasted 6 years, when the fights which have been going on up to the day, the Sunnis and the Shiites practically killing each other. After the Umayyads established a dynasty, the Africans and Arabs established a dynasty. The royal family was holidaying in Damascus, and the Shiites killed 76 members of the royal family and seized power. And then the Umayyads retreated, Abdurrahman retreated back into Africa, brought a great African force back and smashed the Abbasids' renewed power. And he insisted that everybody should live in harmony, that they should not take spite against that Christian, Jews, and Moors should have equal rights. He also insisted that one thing he did insist, he did not, and this is one thing people say, well, okay, but you invaded Europe too, so what are you talking about us invading you? Well, we, the Moors, of which we are a critical part, did not destroy the legal system of Spain and Portugal, did not destroy their churches, did not destroy their language, did not destroy their humanity. So that is not the same thing. Invasion is something everybody expands and invades, but it's not natural to treat people like dogs, like chattel. That was very special. Even in the Romans, when they had slaves, they had laws governing the slaves, far more sophisticated than the laws governing Negroes, quote unquote. So it's not the same thing. That claim cannot be made. That cannot be thrown in our faces. And look, the things they brought in, everything that could be translated. Out of China they brought gunpowder. Out of India they brought the numbers. Europe did not have numbers. It had a number system, but it did not have ciphers. The Romans, more advanced even than the Greeks, had letters for numbers. 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 1, 3 is 1, 1, 1, 4 is 1 V. V is a letter. 5 is V. 6 is V1, 7 V11, 8 V111. That's how they counted, laboriously. The early Africans, the Egyptians, had ciphers. Greece did not. Rome did not. And who do you think brought the ciphers we're using today into Europe? Not Europeans. Europeans didn't invent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Some people claim it came out of India. And recently, about a year ago, someone brought to my attention that at Saqqara, there's a stone in the step pyramid of Saqqara which carries the shape of these numbers, and that Imhotep, at the time of Imhotep, these ciphers are listed alongside of the common ciphers. But we have no dead proof of that. I have sent that around to 6 black mathematicians and no one has yet replied. It is possible one day we will be able to solve it, but one thing is quite clear, it is not European. So comes things from all over the world, the compass, the astrolabe, the ciphers, the calendar, all of these things coming from, and then you're going to hear about how we did it all. We made the world. You see, these are the little people who were backward and did not have a brain like ours, did not have as many convolutions in their brain. Even scripts, which we take for granted, how Europe became so literate. Europe was 99% illiterate the time the Moors attacked in 711 AD. So was the rest of the world. Small cliques everywhere read and wrote. The large amount of people did not. With it was the Muslims who made education important. They made it necessary at a certain level you had to have education. And guess what they introduced? The Africans and Arabs coming out of Morocco and other parts of Africa and Arabia brought into Europe a whole lot of things. Air conditioning for the first time. Bringing water, underground pipes. Bringing water from the mountains for the first time. Baths, public baths for the first time. And bringing so many things, all the great fruits of the world, strawberries and lemons and dates and all of those things introduced into Europe for the first time. The silk industry introduced to Europe for the first time. The rice industry introduced into Europe for the first time. And all the things like us today, for example, in sophisticated Japan, the best cameras, the best radios, the best cars, etc. It's so frightening that at that time, the best things in the world were where the blacks and the Arabs were. The tanneries of Morocco, the sashes of Almeria, the carpets of Tulala, the steel of Damascus, all where the Moors had their centers, that is where the best things were. They introduced optics. The first eyeglasses in the world were made by the Moors. The first experiments with the camera, although it was not yet perfected, was made by the Moors. And we never hear anything about that. They wrote long agricultural treatises. All these things were introduced. The first lighted streets in Europe, the first paved streets in Europe were made by the Moors. And all this in 1492 came to a brutal end. It came to an end before. It came to an end around 1230 AD when the Moors started to retreat until they were left with one place, Granada. And in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for the Caribbean, came the forces of the Spanish, defeating the rest of the Moors who had been split by battles between the Sunnis and the Shiites. They were weakened. The slave trade had weakened, had already begun to affect other parts of Africa. And then eventually you find the fall of the Moors in 1492. And that fall was a tremendous fall because it was to change so many things. And the most important thing it was to change was the attitude of the world towards people of African descent.
The Dogons were already on American land because they simply sailed over by way of the worldwide wind and currents. The first Africans to set foot on American soil were in fact the Dogons of Mali, who used such currents as the Canary and the North Equilateral Current that recycles from West Africa to America and into the upper Atlantic Ocean. This was before the invention of sails. The Guinea Current flows eastward along the Guinea coast, with frequent cycles out to the sea, where it joins the South Equatorial. The second group of Africans to land in America were under the leadership of Abu Bakari in 1311, and had mixed in with the Olmecs and became known as the Washoe. The third group of Africans to land on American soil were the Idrisids, who were the ruling dynasty of southern Morocco and Mauritania, who came into Morocco before the invasion by the Dogon Malians and the Senegalese. This group of Moors arrived in 1727 with Mensa Khan Musa, who was searching for his ancestors of Abu Bakari. And indeed, the Washos were Moors. Let's go back a little bit more and explore this topic about the Moors. I previously stated that the Olmecs were of Mali, and that does make them Moors. Absolutely, the Olmecs were indeed Malian Moors. The Mayans were the descendants of the Malian Moors and were often referred to as Black Mexicans or Quetzalcoatl. There are ancient Mexican wall paintings that depict these Negroid kings as rulers and are unmistakably African. These Moors were the people who built the Great Pyramids all over South America, Peru, Canada, Alaska, and Georgia. Scattered all throughout North America along the Mississippi River and its tributaries are found mounds built out of tons of earth, tons and tons of earth. The people who built them were called the mound builders, and they were the descendants of the Malian Moors, the Olmecs. These Moors eventually migrated to North America from Mexico and became known as the Washita, the Yamasee, and the Ben Ismael tribe. The Ben Ismael tribe was a collection of what is known as the Lenape, the Wampanoag, and the Nanticoke Indians who migrated to Indiana and Illinois and referred to themselves as Moors, even though the United States government continued to classify them as Negroes in order to strip them of their indigenous rights. It is often not talked about, but the Moors had enslaved the Europeans before they enslaved blacks. Their women were sold like commodities into the harems and as concubines of wealthy Moors. This is the reason why the Moorish noble were for the most part bleached out and became as tawny Moors, Turks and Arabs, which are no more than fixed mulatto races. This is also the reason for the Moors in the coats of arms of the noble European families, this so-called black nobility of Europe. The European nations paid tribute to the Moors well into the 18th century. In the book, The United States and Barbary Powers, the English, French, Dutch, Danes, and Swedes, and may I say all nations, are tributary to them. David McRitchie in the book Ancient and Modern Britons says the word blackmail is the result of this tribute paid to the black army or black oppressors as the English referred to them. The Moors had control of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. This is why the Marines sing of defeating the Moors, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, confirming the extent of the Moorish Empire and dominions of Amexem or Atlantis. Here you see the first page of the Moroccan Treaty of 1787. It should also be noted that Shakespeare's most famous Moor, Othello, is also described as a black African. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin worked closely with Moors in the Continental Congress to secure this treaty. In the Bevins collection, there are over 200 letters to the Bey of Morocco from the Continental Congress. There were many Moors in the Continental Congress working with the European Masons originally taught by the Moors to form Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new secular order of the ages, e pluribus unum, out of many peoples, nations, one. The Moroccan Treaty is very powerful because, according to the Constitution, treaties are the law of the land. This treaty specifically deals with Moors. The question that may arise, how do we know that where the treaty says Moors, the so-called black people of the time is being referred to? The Moors were considered citizens or part of the we the people who ratified the Constitution. It says, quote, "Thus an act was passed in Massachusetts on the 6th of March, 1788, forbidding any Negro not a subject of the Empire of Morocco or a citizen of the United States from tarrying in the Commonwealth," unquote. For this would show that those who referred to as Negroes were actually Moors, and that they were on the same footing or status as citizens. Those who remembered that they were Moors used the Moroccan Treaty of 1787 to secure the rights on the same footing as the state citizens without otherwise being obligated members of their social equality. while those who were brainwashed into believing they were Negroes, descendants of Africans brought here by Europeans, were unprotected by the Moroccan Treaty, as well as the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. This document says, and I quote, "A petition was presented to the House from free sundry Moors, subjects of the Emperor of Morocco, and residents in this state, praying that in case they should commit any fault amendable to be brought to justice, that they as subjects to a prince here in North America, in alliance with the United States of America, via the Moroccan Treaty of 1787, may be tried under the same laws as the citizens of the state would be liable to be tried, and not under the Negro Act, which was received and read." End quote. Thus, you have Moors back in 1789 saying what we say now. Our nationality is Moorish, not Negro, black, colored, etc.
Dr. Jose V. Pimenta Bay. One more time, a warm round of applause for Dr. Jose V. Pimenta Bay.
I want to thank you all very much for coming out and giving me an opportunity to share what I hope is relevant and useful information. I, of course, begin by saying in my initial tradition, Islam, I also say Imhotep, and in the Arabic language, Assalamu alaikum. On the left is someone who is Moorish by virtue of his name, his origin, but he is a Christian Moor. And he is a Christian Moor by the name of Saint Maurice, or Saint Moritz in German. Saint Moritz was the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire. So for all of us who came through any type of Catholic background, and no one's talking about Saint Moritz or Saint Benedict the Moor. Or if they talked about it, mentioned him, but they don't go into any details. Oh yeah, the name of this church is, Saint Benedict the Moor. Okay. I'm trying, sister, I'm trying. So Saint Maurice, and this is interesting, his origins are actually in Egypt. Now, this is where we get into understanding this link. And I don't know if I get a chance to go over it all tonight, but this link basically between East Africa and West Africa that Diop essentially laid out so well. When he says, don't forget, because folks in West Africa doesn't mean that they have no connection to people in East Africa. When I would get into debates or discussions with Egyptologists, European Egyptologists, who would tell me, I'm sick of hearing black Americans, I'm using their terms again, I'm sick of hearing black Americans talking about their links to the Egyptians. They came from West Africa. There's no connection. And I said, well, what do you know about the history of migration from East Africa to West Africa? Well, I just know. I said, what do you know? And then usually they don't know anything. See, that's how people say you checkmate them. Because they don't expect you to come with a question that compels them typically to think, well, wait a minute now, this Negro knows more than I thought. This is from a German Bible of the 13th century, and that's the Queen of Sheba. We need, again, I say, to make sure we understand, like I say, the European historical record was clear on indicating the legacy of African, if you will, and Moorish people within its own cultural development. And when you go back and look at some of these early texts, you see evidence of that. But of course, the rise of the enslavement system required the need to hide the history, or, as I say, to alter or obfuscate it. You may have seen Charlotte Sophia von Mecklenburg. Well, Charlotte Sophia von Mecklenburg was the consort or the Queen of England, the wife of King George II. And she was directly descendant of a Moorish woman who was of royal ancestry. Because Europeans were intermarrying, it shouldn't be surprising, Europeans were intermarrying with Moors and Africans, other African peoples. And we need to also understand that England, as early as the 16th century, established a relationship with the Moorish Empire through something called the Barbary Company, which was a trading company. And this trading company was providing England primarily with agricultural products that it needed, foodstuffs. And that relationship would go on for centuries. And sometimes it would be good, and sometimes it would be bad, depending on what was happening politically. That's Alessandro de' Medici. The Medicis, somebody said it looks like Arthur Ashe. Alessandro de' Medici was the son of a pope. Seems to be a contradiction, right? I know popes were supposed to have sons. There's something about celibacy I heard. But it was an immaculate conception. But Alessandro de' Medici was the son of a pope and a Moorish or quote-unquote Negro servant. And the Medicis were the ones responsible for the classical Greek Renaissance that takes place in Europe. They're the patrons of learning. They're the ones that provide so much, financial and political support. Here is a Moroccan sister from a postcard. She's got her baby on her back. This is a Moroccan sister also who was referred to as a Berber. Okay, now let me go back to what I was talking about before. She's a Berber. Okay? She's customarily what Western historians, when they talk about the Moorish legacy and influence, want you to focus in on. All the Moors descended from people who look like her. That's the illusion that people are trying to present. This sister is also referred to as a Berber. They're both Berbers. They're both Berbers. Right? This is also a group of Berbers. Look at the range. Now again, as Leo Africanus, also known as Azayati, said in the 16th century to the European world when he wrote his book about the history of Africa, he said, the people in this part of the world are properly called Moors. That's what they respond to when they come into the Western world. This is a copy of a 15th century text on medical surgery and the type of instruments that were to be used. Now, as I mentioned already, the Moorish presence within Europe results in the change of the whole structure. The establishment of universities at places like Toledo and Salamanca and Cordova and Granada. And outside of Spain, I mentioned places like the University of Naples, whose curriculum and whose very founding was for the purpose of teaching Moorish medical knowledge. We've had people like Ivan van Sertima who've talked about this, and they came before Columbus and then in his edited work, The African Presence in Early America. But before him, before Brother van Sertima, there were Europeans who were saying the same thing, like Leo Weiner, and people like John McIntosh, who was writing in the middle of the 19th century, the Indians of North America, and basically pointed out, these people are related to Africans. These people are related to Ethiopians. Now, Alexander von Wulfenau, who was the German art historian, who wrote the book Unexpected Faces in Ancient America. It's basically a pictorial history and a revelation about the African presence in pre-Columbian America. And it's no accident that this information, although it was part of American folklore at one time, is increasingly denied, and an emphasis is placed upon the idea of African peoples all being brought here on slave ships. Now, this particular artifact or statuette, referred to as an old man with hat, this is from Alexander von Wulfenau's book, is from the classic period, which is between 300 and 900 of the Common Era. This is from Veracruz in Mexico. Now, I don't know about what you see, but that looks like a brother wearing a fez. This is also, this is from, well, you can see it actually in Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus, as well as in von Wulfenau's text. And I like what he did in comparing the chief, the Nuba chief, with the features of this Olmec monument. And those things stand between 7 and 9 feet tall. And some, in fact, are actually larger. It's another. These are all right here in the Americas, and all predate Columbus. This is an Arapaho Indian brother. And this, again, is something that should cause us to pause. When you read references like Hernan Lopez de Castaneda, who wrote a book in the 15th century in which he referred to the peoples living in Panama as part of an Ethiopian tribe, which means that they must have looked like African people. When you consider the evidence, maybe those people who fled had already been there. If you consider the term Indian now, and let me just, this is something again to help you perhaps understand how to reinterpret the term Indian when you go and do some research on your own, which I hope you'll do. At one time, the Europeans used the term Indian or Indias to refer to African people. Now, a lot of folks didn't even know that. It's like, really? Oh, yes. Absolutely. And when people in the early 19th century were reading a book called A Sketch of an African Indian, 1822 by Salop Wellington, and you look at the images, they even give you, pictures. A sketch of an African Indian. They're talking about people from Gambia. The book is about a Gambian, but he's called an African Indian. Given that, what does that make us think when you go back and imagine when Europeans talked about Indians in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries? How did those people look?